Known as the Wolfman, Ronnie believed he was half man, half wolf, and refused to answer to any other name. He also believed human laws did not apply to him and refused to acknowledge his charges. As a result, he remained in a legal limbo because he was unfit for trial. Now it's time for Puppets, Pupils, and Producers, a story of mind over matter. The mental health side of the facility had 8 units, which for recreational purposes were separated into 2 groups. Units 1 to 4 belonged to the first group, and units 5 to 8 belonged to the other. Referred to as the north side and the south side, the 2 groups went outside to a smaller exercise yard once a day. In the summer months, they opened the big yard, which all units attended every evening. The patients could also go to the gym where they'd play a game of floor hockey, volleyball, or basketball, or they'd go to the rec center where they could play pool, ping pong, or a video game. Regardless of what they were doing and where they were, the patients were under the supervision of the nurses and the assistants at all times, in a ratio of, at the very most, 5 patients to 1 staff. The correctional side had 4 pods and 20 segregation cells. It also had its own yard, exercise equipment, and recreation center. Other than using the same chapel, but at different times, the patients and the inmates had separate areas and purposely never saw the other. But because they shared the same physical structure, fire alarms were announced throughout the facility. Once engaged, every patient, inmate, and staff member prepared to evacuate and could not resume activities until the local fire chief gave the all clear. All other alarms were announced on the affected side only and were cleared by a security chief from the Great Divide. Even though they didn't necessarily hear the others' alarms, it wouldn't take long before everyone knew about the unusual or injurious incidents on either side via the security chiefs, who'd concoct tales that protected some and exposed others. The same was true when it came to gossip about the staff. If the security chief respected you, the rumors stopped at his ears. If they didn't, they spread it. For that reason, the truth, which was that Sam pursued Cassie and they'd fallen in love over the phone, wasn't repeated, while the one involving Cassie the home-wrecking witch, who'd cast a love spell upon poor Sam, was the talk of the whole facility. Cassie requested a transfer to one of the 4 units belonging to the South Side group, so she wouldn't have to see Sam when they supervised recreational activities. The manager of Unit 8 was excited to welcome Cassie to his team. However, her transfer couldn't occur until the beginning of the next schedule. In the meantime, it was suggested she could work night shifts in the local hospital where one of their patients was dying. Cassie knew Ronnie's case well. In fact, she was with the doctor when he told him he had stage 4 lung cancer. So she knew that despite being deemed incapable to consent to his mental health treatment, he'd met the criteria for medical capacity and had clearly stated he'd rather die sooner than later and didn't want to go through chemo or radiation. She also knew that, unlike other patients who wanted to die in a medical hospital, Ronnie wanted to die in his own bed at the facility, not only because it had been his home for almost 25 years, but because he could smoke whenever he wanted. His second wish, however, conflicted with the facility's policy, so when his time neared, he was transferred to the general hospital for end-of-life care. Known as the Wolfman, Ronnie believed he was half man, half wolf, and refused to answer to any other name. He also believed human laws did not apply to him and refused to acknowledge his charges. As a result, he remained in a legal limbo because he was unfit for trial. During his brief periods of lucidity, Ronnie spoke fondly about his life with his ex-wife and 2 children, and he'd sincerely ask what he'd ever done to deserve his mental illness. Most of the time, however, he had little insight into why he was repeatedly arrested for howling outside of her house or for peeing around the perimeter of her yard, because in his mind, restraining orders didn't apply to animals and divorces didn't exist because wolves mate for life. Over the years, he'd stopped howling except for during the full moons, and he'd stopped biting as often and gave a warning growl instead. What hadn't changed was his habit of squatting on the toilet and lifting his leg to pee. Including the small emergency department, the local hospital had 80 beds, and because it was owned by the Catholic Church, a few of the nurses were nuns as well. Ronnie wasn't a religious man, so when it came time, he didn't want to receive his last rites. He did, however, want to see his family one last time, which unfortunately would not happen. He also wanted to die on his birthday, which unfortunately wouldn't happen either, but he came pretty darn close. Once he was told his cancer was terminal, he wrote letters to the people who no longer took his calls and made a list of the patients he wanted to give his belongings to. He also prepared a manila envelope containing $25 cash, a back scratcher, and 1 package of cigarettes that, once finished, would signal his imminent death, because being part wolf meant he'd instinctively know when it was time for him to lie down for the last time. Since he was in legal custody, 2 staff from the facility provided round-the-clock security, while their nurses handled his medical care. However, the local hospital's policies took precedence, so despite his being too weak to walk, he had to be cuffed to the bed rail or to his other wrist at all times. Cassie arrived for her first night shift, and once she exited her vehicle, she could hear Ronnie howling, which was a bad sign considering there wasn't a full moon. Following his howl instead of her instructions, she found Ronnie at the far end of the pediatric unit because they didn't want to upset the adult patients who'd see his security measures and realize he was from the facility. Stopping at the nursing station, Cassie introduced herself to the charge nurse, who said their shared patient had refused all of his medications and had been howling ever since the shift manager decided he wasn't allowed to go smoke because he had lung cancer. She added his urinal was full and he was threatening to throw it at anyone who came near his bed. Disagreeing with the manager's decision, Cassie sarcastically remarked how that ship had already sailed and asked to speak with her. Although the charge nurse agreed, she warned that Sister Susan was the meanest nun she'd ever met, and those who challenged her decisions didn't fare well. Cassie believed her job was to advocate for her patient regardless of where they were, and said so. Then she issued her own warning, which was that unless they were going to sedate him, which she'd challenge, he'd continue to howl and cause problems. The experienced charge nurse and Cassie knew that sometimes you had to bend the rules a little, especially when dealing with pediatric and psychiatric patients. So they ignored the best practice rules for nurses, and Cassie took the pills the other nurse had poured and suggested that once he calmed down, she'd take Ronnie outside for a cigarette and if Sister Susan found out, she'd play dumb. After a short negotiation, Ronnie handed over his urinal and took the pills. When his pain and agitation lessened, Cassie and her partner for the night put him in a wheelchair and took him outside for 2 cigarettes. Despite Ronnie's more relaxed state and the fact that peace had been restored throughout the small hospital, Sister Susan saw them outside and wasn't pleased. Once he was back in his room, she asked to speak with Cassie in the hallway. Stating she was disgusted but not surprised that a nurse from the facility would encourage a patient smoking, she instructed that he wasn't to go outside again. In the most professional tone she could muster, Cassie explained that Ronnie had smoked for over 50 years, and because he could smoke any time he wanted at the facility, it was very stressful for him to go without. But Sister Susan didn't care, so Cassie upped the ante by asking if there was a doctor's order to support Ronnie's restrictions, when she knew there already wasn't. Cassie prepared Ronnie for bed and offered to give him a soothing back rub. Once he rolled over, she could feel the tumors overtaking his lungs and held back her tears when he said it had been decades since someone had touched him with such kindness. Without mentioning her disagreement with Sister Susan, Cassie documented Ronnie's agitation upon her arrival and made sure it was clear that he calmed down after he had 2 cigarettes. In the morning, she gave report to her colleagues from the facility and suggested they ask his doctor to write an order stating he could go outside to smoke. After 2 days off, Cassie returned and was pleased to learn the doctor had given Ronnie smoking privileges because he agreed that keeping him calm and comfortable during the last days of his life was the goal. With only 5 cigarettes remaining, Cassie let him decide how many he wanted to smoke that evening. And this time, she held back her tears when he said he was saving the last 3 cigarettes for the next day. The first he hoped to enjoy with his last morning coffee. The second he hoped to enjoy after his last meal. And he wanted to enjoy the third while drinking strawberry tea with Cassie. She returned the next evening with 2 extra-large cups of strawberry tea and another package of cigarettes just in case. They stayed outside for as long as Ronnie wanted and listened while he reminisced about his life. He said he regretted 3 things, including never once trying to quit smoking, and added that throughout his life, cigarettes had been his one reliable friend. Whether happy or sad, they'd always been there for him, but now he wished he hadn't denied their toxicity and thought his life and death would have been much different had he quit. His second regret involved marrying a dog instead of a wolf. He went on to explain that while dogs could be loyal to one partner at a time, they weren't wolves who mated for life. Had he known the difference before, he said come hell or high water, he'd still be married and wouldn't be dying alone. His last regret involved his father, who he said treated him and his mother worse than their dogs. Ronnie began to well up and asked if they'd bear witness to his last confession. His story began on the day he arrived home from school and found his father barely alive from a self-inflicted gunshot. Beside him lay his mother, whom he'd shot first. Only 10 years old at the time, he shared how instead of calling for an ambulance, he went into his bedroom and drowned out the sounds of his father's gurgling while listening to the Wolfman Jack show.
I tell you, you're gonna love it. I mean, when it comes to music, the old Wolfman knows. If I'm lying, I'm dying.
When the countdown of the latest hits finished, He said he returned to his father's side and placed his hands over his nose and mouth until he finally died. Assuming that ending his father's life was his confession and last regret, Cassie offered her condolences and support, but Ronnie corrected her and clarified his third regret revolved around not shooting his father himself, thereby preventing his mother's murder. And his confession was that he knew he wasn't part wolf, but just like the famous DJ, he'd created the persona because it was far better than being known as the kid whose parents died by murder-suicide. He lit his last cigarette in his package and inhaled a cloud of smoke, which his expiring lungs refused to accept. His chest seized and he wheezed until he finally coughed and his mouth filled with his blood. After getting him back into bed, Cassie removed his handcuffs and gave him another back rub. Once his morphine kicked in and he was comfortable, she pulled the chain to lower the light, and it broke. With on or off her only options, she turned the main light out so Ronnie could sleep and let the charge nurse know it needed to get fixed in the morning. Once their eyes adjusted to the courtyard lights, they could see Ronnie just fine. They flipped through magazines and played solitaire while they listened for Ronnie's last breath. A couple of hours later, her partner went to get them a snack from the vending machine. Shortly after, the door burst open and the bright overhead lights came on. For a second, she was blinded and wondered why her partner would do such a thing. Then she realized it was Sister Susan, who angrily accused her of sleeping on the job before leaving with the same intensity she'd arrived with. Ronnie did not stir, so Cassie turned the lights out again, and when her partner returned, she went looking for the nun. She found her in her office, where she explained what had happened with the chain, but Sister Susan wasn't interested in Ronnie's comfort. Instead, she said Cassie was one of those nurses who couldn't handle working in a general hospital, so they worked in psych. Then she said she wasn't getting paid to sleep, and she'd be reporting Cassie to her superiors in the morning. Cassie said she'd be filing a complaint as well, and she'd do everything in her power to change the policy so patients could die at the facility, where they were treated with dignity and respect. The nun laughed. Dignity and respect for werewolves and witches. You're as crazy as them. And obviously just as stupid. Now get out of my office before I call security. After clarifying he was a wolfman, not a werewolf, Cassie left the office. As she walked through the darkened halls, she collected herself and thought about what she wanted to say but didn't. Then she wondered if the nun had called her a witch because she knew she was one. Ronnie never awoke again and died 2 days later. They held a service for him at the facility, and after singing a closing hymn, they all howled together. He was buried in a local cemetery, where, as requested, his tombstone read, "Here lies the Wolfman, a.k.a. Ronald Campbell." When Cassie arrived for her first shift on Unit 8, she was summoned to her new manager's office, where she was given a copy of Sister Susan's complaint. Along with describing her as unprofessional and verbally aggressive, she described how she'd opened Ronnie's door without making a sound, and because the courtyard lights provided enough light, she could clearly see Cassie sleeping. Cassie denied sleeping on the job and said she'd discuss her response with her union, and added she'd be filing a complaint against the nun as well. Then she asked for his help in starting a palliative care program at the facility. After receiving report and her new patient assignments, the team leader handed Cassie a manila envelope labeled "The Wolfman," and said it was from a nurse at the General Hospital. She pulled out the package of papers and read the attached handwritten note first. Then she read her typewritten statement describing Sister Susan's known discrimination against patients and staff from the facility, a photocopy of her nursing notes detailing their interactions moments before the nuns' arrival that night, and a copy of the requisition to fix the light were in there as well.
He gon' rate your record high.